Wealth Attraction Research, WAR, Inequality. Wealth Attraction Research, WAR, Inequality. You're listening to Wealth Attraction Research, WAR, WAR, Inequality, presented by Hakeem Ali Bokus Alexander on Wisdom, Social Audio Inc., and Spreaker, Social Podcasting, presented for World Reading Club in association with ExercisingYourMind.com and UniquilibriuM. This edition's reading focus comes to us from Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, 1776, and comes in two parts. The first part is called Inequalities Arising from the Nature of the Employments Themselves, and part two will be titled, if I can find that here in the book, it's rather long, Inequalities Occasioned by the Policy of Europe. All right, so the introduction to part one is as follows. Of wages and profit in the different employments of labor and stock. This is chapter 10 in the Wealth of Nations. The whole of the advantages and disadvantages of the different employments of labor and stock must, in the same neighborhood, be either perfectly equal or continually tending to equality. If in the same neighborhood there was any employment evidently either more or less advantageous than the rest, so many people would crowd into it in the one case, and so many would desert it in the other, that its advantages would soon return to the level of other employments. This, at least, would be the case in a society where things were left to follow their natural course, where there was perfect liberty, and where every man was perfectly free to choose what occupation he thought proper, and to change it as often as he thought proper. Every man's interest would prompt him to seek the advantageous and to shun the disadvantageous employment. So all that makes sense so far, right? That if there was different employments of labor and the things to be sold, it would be perfectly equal all the time, right, in the same neighborhood. But if it was more or less advantageous than the rest, right, people would either flock to it if it was more and vacate it or desert it if it wasn't. And this at least would be the case in a society where things were left to follow their natural course, where there was perfect liberty. But he continues, right, where there was perfect liberty. Pecuniary or money wages pertaining to money, pecuniary wages and profit indeed are everywhere in Europe extremely different according to the different employments of labor and stock. But this difference arises partly from certain circumstances in the employments themselves, which either really, or at least in the imaginations of men, make up for a small pecuniary gain in some, and counterbalance a great one in others, and partly from the policy of Europe, which nowhere leaves things at perfect liberty. The particular consideration of those circumstances and of that policy will divide this chapter into two parts. All right, so this should be part one here. I'm going to edit that right now because I forgot to do that. This is Inequality, Part 1. I'll just put a P and a 1 as a designator and save that. All right, so Part 1, Inequalities Arising from the Nature of the Employments Themselves. The 5 following are the principal circumstances which, so far as I have been able to observe, make up for a small pecuniary gain in some employments, and counterbalance a great one in others. First, the agreeableness or disagreeableness of the employments themselves. Secondly, the easiness and cheapness, or the difficulty and expense of learning them. Thirdly, the constancy or inconstancy of employment in them. Fourthly, the small or great trust which must be reposed in those who exercise them. And fifthly, the probability or improbability of success in them. So all that makes sense, right? The agreeableness or disagreeableness of the employments, right? So whether or not the job is likable or not likable, right? Which is, they make up for a small pecuniary, right? The money gain in some employments and counterbalance a great one in others, right? Secondly, the easiness or cheapness or the difficulty and expense of learning them, right? A trade or craft as a skilled laborer. Thirdly, the constancy or inconstancy of employment in them, right? The stability of the job, like people want job security. Fourthly, the small or great trust which must be reposed in those who exercise them, how much responsibility you have in the job. And fifthly, the probability or improbability of success in them, whether or not you'll be good at the job, even though you may have trained for it and all that good stuff. So first, the wages of labor vary with the ease or hardship, the cleanliness or dirtiness, the honorableness or dishonorableness of the employment. Thus, in most places, take the year round, a journeyman tailor earns less than a journeyman weaver. His work is much easier. A journeyman weaver earns less than a journeyman smith. His work is not always easier, but it is much cleanlier. A journeyman blacksmith, though an artificer, seldom earns so much in 12 hours as a collier, who is only a laborer, does in 8. Right? The blacksmith, even though he makes stuff, he seldom earns so much in 12 hours as a collier, who's a coal mine worker, or a coal merchant, right? His work is not quite so dirty, is less dangerous, and is carried on in daylight and above ground. And so again, that was his principal circumstances, right? And that was, one of them was the cleanliness or dirtiness, right, of the job, right? So honor makes a great part of reward in all honorable professions. In point of pecuniary gain, remember pecuniary is a word that means just of or pertaining to money. So in point of money gain, we could say, right? All things considered, they are generally under recompensed, as I shall endeavor to show by and by. Disgrace has the contrary effect. So that's interesting, right? Honor makes a great part of the reward of all honorable professions, right? If you have an honorable professions in point of gain of money, all things considered, they're generally under recompensed, undercompensated, right? As I shall endeavor to show. Disgrace has the contrary effect, right? So this is about the honorable or dishonorable, right? And you got to remember these words are being used in 1776, so they're not always exactly the same as they do now. The trade of the butcher is a brutal and odious business, but it is in most places more profitable than the greater part of common trades. The most detestable of all employments, that of public executioner, is, in proportion to the quantity of work done, better paid than any common trade whatever. So, I mean, you can imagine why, if you're a public executioner. I mean, they still have those today, right? There are some places, I think at least one state in the U.S. that still uses a firing squad, some others that do hanging, and of course there's a good old gas chamber and electric chair, or lethal injection. So you can imagine these people are paid more in proportion to the quantity of work done, because it's not like you're executing people every day, right? That would be crazy. All right. And so you got to get paid more. You're not running around executing people all the time. Is that your sole profession? That you're a killer of killers? Can't imagine. And I've never really thought about that. How how sick would that be? That you have to have that kind of job. But hey, as they say, somebody's got to do it. Continuing, hunting and fishing, the most important employments of mankind in the rude state of society, become, in its advanced state, their most agreeable amusements. Right? So hunting and fishing, which is important in the rude state, or back in the day, he's saying, even from then, the rude state of society, hunting and fishing become, in its advanced state of society, their most agreeable amusements, and they pursue for pleasure what they once followed from necessity. In the advanced state of society, therefore, they are all very poor people who follow as a trade what other people pursue as a pastime. Fishermen have been so since the time of Theocritus. A poacher is everywhere a very poor man in Great Britain. In countries where the rigor of the law suffers no poachers, the licensed hunter is not in a much better condition. The natural taste for those employments makes more people follow them than can live comfortably by them, and the produce of their labor, in proportion to its quantity, comes always too cheap to market to afford anything but the most scanty subsistence to the laborers. Disagreeableness and disgrace affect the profits of stock in the same manner as the wages of labor. So what is he said here, right, is that something like an honorable profession, you don't get compensated as much, where disgraceful ones, like being an executioner or hunting and fishing, where an executioner gets paid more, right? But something basic needs like hunting and fishing, though, people are usually poor who do them, and they usually just choose them as pastimes in more advanced societies where it's not the necessity to do so. Continuing, the keeper of an inn or tavern, who is never master of his own house, and who is exposed to the brutality of every drunkard, exercises neither a very agreeable nor a very creditable business, but there is scarce any common trade in which a small stock yields so great a profit. Right? Yeah, I mean, think about that, like a keeper of an inn or tavern. And let's look at the tavern, right? Such a small stock. If you think about bars and stuff like that, how low the overhead in many cases is compared to how much they make off of that liquor. You know, that one bottle that may have cost them $15, but they sell a shot for $5, and you've got like 100 shots or something in a bottle. Let's just say 20, right? So let's just say the bottle costs $20, and each shot costs $5, right? And you got, let's say, 20 shots, and then you got 100. You're making 5 times more than you paid for the bottle on each one. Of course, there's other considerations to be made, but that's just a very oversimplified example. And as Adam Smith writes, but there is scarce any common trade in which a small stock yields so great a profit. Secondly, the wages of labor vary with the easiness and cheapness or the difficulty and expense of learning the business. When any expensive machine is erected, the extraordinary work to be performed by it before it is worn out, it must be expected, will replace the capital laid out upon it, with at least the ordinary profits. So getting and buying a machine and using it, right, it will be expected to replace the money that was spent in getting it and placing it there, right? At least with the ordinary profits of the business, right? So a man educated at the expense of much labor and time to any of those employments which require extraordinary dexterity and skill may be compared to one of those expensive machines. The work which he earns, or the work which he learns to perform, it must be expected, over and above the usual wage of common labor, will replace to him the whole expense of his education, with at least the ordinary profits of an equally valuable capital, right? So it's expected, over and above the usual wages of common labor, will replace the whole expense of his education, with at least the ordinary profits of an equally valuable capital. It must do this, too, in a reasonable time, regard being had to the very uncertain duration of human life, in the same manner as to the more certain duration of the machine. So, this person who learns something like like through an apprenticeship or whatnot, and however much that cost will be replaced to him. It must, in a reasonable time, be replaced to him, but with much less certainty than that would be replaced with a machine, right? That they compared him to earlier. All right, the difference between the wages of skilled labor and those of common labor is founded upon this principle, right? So you got people who are skilled, who usually get paid more than people who are unskilled. So people who have training, education, apprenticeships, and things like that will usually get paid more than those who haven't done that kind of training, like trade schools and things like that. The policy of Europe considers the labor of all mechanics, artificers, and manufacturers as skilled labor, and that of all country laborers as common labor. It seems to suppose that of the former to be of a more nice and delicate nature than that of the latter. It is so, perhaps, in some cases, but in the greater part it is quite otherwise, as I shall endeavor to show by and by. The laws and customs of Europe, therefore, in order to qualify any person for exercising the one species of labor, impose the necessity of an apprenticeship, though with different degrees of rigor in different places. They leave the other free and open to everybody. So the skilled laborer needs apprenticeship, but the common laborer is free and open to everybody. During the continuance of the apprenticeship, the whole labor of the apprentice belongs to his master. In the meantime, he must, in many cases, be maintained by his parents or relations, and in almost all cases must be clothed by them. Some money, too, is commonly given to the master for teaching him his trade. They who cannot give money give time or become bound for more than the usual number of years, a consideration which, though is not always advantageous to the master on account of the usual idleness of apprentices, is always disadvantageous to the apprentice. So a couple points to make here. And do note that I was here recording earlier, and then there was a big outage for some reason. I don't know if anybody else got knocked off, but I wonder if it had something to say with what I mentioned about what I'm going to say now. We're going to see what happens here as a test. So this part here, I was talking about various different scientists and people, like, for one, Kary Mullis, who the company he worked for when he developed the polymerase chain reaction, they owned that property that he made while working underneath them, even though he was the inventor of it. But because of his contract, anything that he created under there belonged to them. And so that's what this says here, right? That the apprentice, it says, during the continuance of the apprenticeship, the whole labor of the apprentice belongs to his master. So anything that's created there belongs to the master or the employer, right? So that they can then put those things that are created in their stock and then sell that through their business. Which is also like any job that you go to. So an apprenticeship is like having a job that you are learning at, right? Where most jobs you do, but they onboard you much more quickly usually in training. There's a lot of really great apprentices, like Michael Faraday, for example, who was a pioneer in electricity and magnetism, who actually created the first electric motor, was an apprentice to Humphrey Davy, who was a renowned, I think chemist at his time or something like that. Let me take a look. But he far surpassed him in the things that he created and his offers to the world, at least in my opinion. Let me just make sure this is right. Let's ask Mr. and Mrs. Googles. Humphrey Davy. Yep, British chemist. That's right, he was a chemist. So Sir Humphrey Davy, first baronet, was a British chemist and inventor who invented the Davy lamp and a very early form of arc lamp. But let's see. Davy also studied the forces involved in these separations, inventing the new field of electrochemistry. I'm pretty sure that he didn't invent the new field of electrochemistry, and that was of his apprentice, who was Michael Faraday, in which I'm going to look at Michael Faraday right now. You'll see that Michael Faraday, 1791 to 1867, was an English scientist who contributed to the study of electromagnetism and electrochemistry, exactly as I thought. His main discoveries include the principles underlying electromagnetic induction, diamagnetism, and electrolysis. Although Faraday received little formal education, he was one of the most influential scientists in history. It was by his research on the magnetic field around a conductor carrying a direct current that Faraday established the concept of the electromagnetic field in physics. Faraday also established that magnetism could affect rays of light, and that there was an underlying relationship between the two phenomena. He similarly discovered the principles of electromagnetic induction, diamagnetism, and the laws of electrolysis. His inventions of electromagnetic rotary devices formed the foundation of electric motor technology, and it was largely due to his efforts that electricity became practical for use in technology. You see, and if we just go back and look at Humphrey Davy, there's hardly anything like that attributed to him. He didn't, he just has a bunch of degrees. He was a baronet, president of the Royal Society, a member of the Royal Irish Academy, fellow of the Geological Society, and a member of the American Philosophical Society. Berzelius called Davy's 1806 Beckerian lecture on some chemical agencies of electricity one of the best memoirs which has ever enriched the theory of chemistry. However, I'm pretty sure that most of that stuff came from Michael Faraday, because he's very unimpressive to me in comparison. But this is an example of this right here, of what I was saying, that the whole labor, right, of an apprentice belongs to his master. So there you go. That's a clear case of that. And I read Michael Faraday's book some time ago called I think it was called The Chemical History of a Flame or a Candle or something like that. Let me take a look. I just want to know for sure, because I have that book in my library in California. The Chemical History of a Candle. Let's see. A course of 6 lectures on the chemical history of a candle. Yep, that's what it's called. To which is added a lecture on platinum. Wow. A book by Michael Faraday. There we go. That was it. All right. Ooh, what is this? It says read now, download free of charge. I might do that. A course, 6 lectures on the... Yeah, I'm going to get that for my... Because I really like that book. Let me see what it looks like here. Woohoo! It was on Google Books for free from the Harvard College Library. Nice. Chemical History of a Candle. All right, let me not get sidetracked. I really get excited about geeking out about these scientists and stuff like that. So, but here we are on back to the inequalities here in Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. All right. So continuing. It is reasonable, therefore, that in Europe the wages of mechanics, artificers, and manufacturers should be somewhat higher than those of common laborers. They are so accordingly, and their superior gains make them in most places be considered as a superior rank of people. This superiority, however, is generally very small. The daily or weekly earnings of journeymen in the more common sorts of manufactures, such as those of plain linen and woolen cloth, computed at an average are, in most places, very little more than the day wages of common laborers. Their employment, indeed, is more steady and uniform, and the superiority of their earnings, taking the whole year together, may be somewhat greater. It seems evidently, however, to be no greater than what is sufficient to compensate the superior expense of their education. So he's saying they're basically getting paid the same, because their compensation is not that much more than what is to cover their the education that they had to pay out in order to get that gig in the first place, right? So it's not that big of a deal in most cases. So yeah, they're getting paid more, but for a time they have to pay out back to their master, as he's calling it here, right? They have to pay him back for the expenses of their apprenticeship and all that, and maybe back to, their family or relations, as they say, their parents and relations, for clothing them and housing them and feeding them. which is still something that we know of now. People call it by different names. It's the same thing with college students and others, or people who go into trade school who live with their parents while they're working their way through school until they get their job, whatever, right? All right, so continuing. All right, so education in the ingenious arts and the liberal professions is still more tedious and expensive. The pecuniary recompense, therefore, of painters and sculptors, of lawyers and physicians, ought to be much more liberal, and it is so accordingly. The profits of stock seem to be very little affected by the easiness or difficulty of learning the trade in which it is employed. Right? So profits of stock. Remember, what are the profits? Every time I hear the word profits, I always hear Jim Rohn's voice saying profits are better than wages. With the profits of stock, meaning you already have the things that are produced by the laborers and the journeymen and all that, right? And now you have it in your store to sell. That's your stock, right? We all know what it is, right? What do you got in stock, right? And the profits they make off of that, right, seem to be very little affected by the easiness or difficulty of learning the trade in which it is employed, right? Very little affected by whether or not you learn to be a good marketer or not, very easily or very difficultly. And he continues, all the different ways in which stock is commonly employed in great towns seem, in reality, to be almost equally easy and equally difficult to learn. One branch either of foreign or domestic trade cannot well be a much more intricate business than another. So he's saying selling, although as Dan Kennedy says that the highest paid skill on the planet is getting people to the door, and the person that knows how to do this gets all the money, right? It doesn't matter how easy or difficult it was to learn that. It's same, right? You just, it can't, he's saying it cannot well be a much more intricate business than another, whether it's foreign or domestic trade. Thirdly, the wages of labor in different occupations vary with the constancy or inconstancy of employment. Employment is much more constant in some trades than in others. In the greater part of manufactures, a journeyman may be pretty sure of employment almost every day in the year that he is able to work. A mason or bricklayer, on the contrary, can work neither in hard frost nor in foul weather, and his employment at all other times depends upon the occasional calls of his customers. He is liable, in consequence, to be frequently without any. What he earns, therefore, while he is employed, must not only maintain him while he is idle, but make him some compensation for those anxious and desponding moments which the thought of so precarious a situation must sometimes occasion. Where the computed earnings of the greater part of manufacturers, accordingly, are nearly upon a level with the daily wages of common laborers, those of masons and bricklayers are generally from one half more to double those wages, right? So that's interesting, right? Again, so depending on how scarce your work may be or how often you're able to work, it may be one half to double the wages of common laborers, right? The day wages of common laborers. Where common laborers earn 4 and 5 shilling a week, masons and bricklayers frequently earn 7 and 8. Where the former earn 6, the latter often earn 9 and 10. And where the former earn 9 and 10, as in London, the latter commonly earn 15 and 18. No species of skilled labor, however, seems more easy to learn than that of masons and bricklayers. Chairmen in London, during the summer seasons, are said sometimes to be employed as bricklayers. The high wages of those workmen, therefore, are not so much the recompense of their skill as the compensation for the inconsistency of their employment. A house carpenter seems to exercise rather a nicer and more ingenious trade than a mason. In most places, however, for it is not universally so, his day wages are somewhat lower. His employment, though it depends much, does not depend so entirely upon the occasional calls of his customers, and it is not liable to be interrupted by the weather. When the trades, which generally afford constant employment, happen in a particular place not to do so, the wages of the workmen always rise a good deal above their ordinary proportion to those of common labor. In London, almost all journeyman artificers are liable to be called upon and dismissed by their masters from day to day and from week to week, in the same manner as day laborers in other places. You know, I pick a lot of people up from Amazon, the Amazon warehouses, and I see this a lot. Like, a lot of people get dismissed or called in at a whim because of how much or how little work is going on in the warehouse. And some of them gladly take it because sometimes they're working 12-hour shifts and they're glad to get cut early when the work is done. And they think it's a good thing. So we still have this practice, of course, in all kinds of places, especially with day laborers. I had to take a sip of tea and a bite. All right, when the trades, which generally afford constant employment, happen in a particular place not to do so, the wages of the workmen always rise a good deal above their ordinary proportion to those of common labor. In London, almost all journeyman artificers are liable to be called upon and dismissed by their masters from day to day, and from week to week, in the same manner as day laborers in other places. The lowest order of artificers, journeymen, tailors, accordingly, earn their half a crown a day, though 18 pence may be reckoned the wages of common labor. In small towns, and what the heck is a crown? Right. What is a crown in this? A crown. A crown in currency. Okay, I have no idea. This is a little bit older, so I don't really see it. Okay. In 1551, Edward VI issued a large silver coin of the value of 5 shillings, and as its currency value was the same as that of gold, the gold crown, it took its name from that coin. So maybe that's 5 shillings, I don't know. The comparison he's making here. Okay, so the lowest order of artificers, journeymen, tailors, accordingly, earn their half a crown a day, though 18 pence may be reckoned the wages of the common laborer. In small towns and country villages, the wages of journeyman tailors frequently scarce equal those of common labor, but in London they are often many weeks without employment, particularly during the summer. That sucks. When the inconstancy of employment is combined with the hardship, disagreeableness, and dirtiness of the work, it sometimes raises the wages of the most common labor above those of the most skilled artificers. A collier, remember this is a coal mine worker, coal worker, working by the piece is supposed at Newcastle to earn commonly about double, and in many parts of Scotland about 3 times the wages of common labor. His high wages arise altogether from the hardship, disagreeableness, and dirtiness of his work. His employment may, upon most occasions, be as constant as he pleases. The coal heavers in London exercise a trade which in hardship, dirtiness, and disagreeableness almost equals that of colliers. And from the unavoidable irregularity in the arrivals of coal ships, the employment of the greater part of them is necessarily very inconstant. If colliers, therefore, commonly earn double and triple the wages of common labor, it ought not to seem unreasonable that coal heavers should sometimes earn 4 and 5 times those wages. In the enquiry made into their condition a few years ago, it was found that at the rate at which they were then paid, they could earn from 6 to 10 shillings a day. 6 shillings are about 4 times the wages of common labor in London, and in every particular trade, the lowest common earnings may always be considered as those of the far greater number. How extravagant soever those earnings may appear, if they were more than sufficient to compensate all the disagreeable circumstances of the business. There would soon be so great a number of competitors as, in a trade which has no exclusive privilege, would quickly reduce them to a lower rate. Yeah. So, yeah, if however extravagant their earnings may be, if they were more sufficient to compensate all the disagreeable circumstances of business, there would soon be so great a number of competitors for that job. Yeah, in a trade which has no exclusive privilege, right? Because they're laborers. Like, it was not that they need to go to school for or learn the trade as apprentices. It would, if there was such a competition, because of if it was more than sufficient to compensate the disagreeable circumstance, like the dirtiness and stuff like that, and so many people would want to do it, but then it would quickly drop that rate to very low. Continuing, the constancy or inconstancy of employment cannot affect the ordinary profits of stock in any particular trade. Yeah. Cannot affect the ordinary profits of stock. Yeah. So whether the stock is or is not constantly employed depends not upon the trade, but the trader. Fourthly, and that means, the stock is constantly employed depends. So the stock could be, again, the stuff that makes the things that you use, the raw materials, or the stuff itself that's produced by the laborers and workers that's sold in the end, right? And it depends. Whether the stock is or is not constantly employed depends on the trade. Not upon the trade, but the trader. How often, how hard that person works. Fourthly, the wages of labor vary according to the small or great trust which must be reposed in the workmen. Yes, and here we go, right? The wages of goldsmiths and jewelers are everywhere superior to those of many other workmen, not only of equal, but of much superior ingenuity on account of the precious materials with which they are entrusted. We trust our health to the physicians, our fortune and sometimes our life and reputation to the lawyer and attorney. Such confidence could not safely be reposed in people of a very mean or low condition. Their reward must be such, therefore, as may give them that rank in the society which so important a trust requires. The long time and the great expense which must be laid out in their education, when combined with this circumstance, necessarily enhance still further the price of their labor. I love how detailed he is in explaining every single bit of why people are paid the way they are and in the proportions they are, and it just makes so much clear sense, right? So many people have probably never even, I haven't really thought of it in this great detail before. It's something that we know intuitively, but to have it spelled out is so interesting because it gives so much more of appreciation, and it's actually a way to alchemically, right, figure in how to hack these systems to actually bring more your way. And what do I mean by that, right? Because a high level of trust, right, that's instilled in you, as well as a high level of skill, right, from training, meaning how can you hack into that? Well, earn yourself a high level of skill, right, either by self-education and making that known. Actually, even one of the things that happens with me and what I learned in Speechcraft when I was in the Hypnosis Motivation Institute, which was basically a year-long apprenticeship, going through, I forget how many hours, it was like 720 hours at a base, not including the clinical residency that we had to do and all the other stuff that went along with it. But there is a high level of skill that's earned, but also when you're somebody's clinical hypnotist or hypnotherapist, as you can also be called according to the United States Department of Occupations, you are, a great deal of trust is instilled to you, and therefore you can command a higher wage. Like for example, most hypnotists in Tarzana, California, we could easily start out by charging $125 for an hour, for a single hour session. Now, of course, the things that he's talking about here is very interesting because it is a self-employed, right? You're an entrepreneur and you're building your own business as a clinical hypnotist. The constancy, right? Or inconstancy, right, is not as certain as somebody who has a job, right? So of course, that is another factor that plays into the higher wage in some ways, as he's already laid out here. So it's very interesting about some ways you can hack by earning a high level of skill and dexterity in what you do, being very good at it, and of course you got to let that be known, right? Also, gaining a high level of trust. Some marketers have kind of tapped into that, even though some of them do it very superficially and in a fake way, but it's KLT, right? Getting people to know, like, and trust you, right? And so those are some things that take into consideration to think about your financial hacks and doing it in the best way you possibly can in order to actually have the high level of skill and trust and deserve it. Okay, continuing, the wages of goldsmiths and jewelers are everywhere superior to those of many other workmen, not only of equal but of much superior ingenuity, on account of the precious materials in which they are entrusted. We trust our health to the physician, our fortune and sometimes our life and reputation to the lawyer and attorney. Such confidence could not safely be reposed in people of a very mean or low condition. The reward must be such, therefore, as may give them that rank in society which so important a trust requires. The long time and the great expense which must be laid out in their education, when combined with this circumstance, necessarily enhance still further the price of their labor. When a person employs only his stock in trade, there is no trust, and the credit which he may get from the people depends not upon the nature of his trade, but upon their opinion of his fortune, probity, and prudence. The different rates of profit, therefore, in the different branches of trade cannot arise from the different degrees of trust reposed in the trades. Right? So people don't really care about your trust or whatever in that so much, right? It's about, they care about the opinion of their fortune and probity and prudence. Well, what does that mean, probity and prudence? Well, probity, I don't know. Let's see what that is. Okay. The quality of having strong moral principles, okay? So it kind of in a way is trust, right? And but it's how much they like you, so how much they care about, like how moral and ethical you are. And acting or showing with care and thought for the future, prudence. Okay. So whether you're moral and ethical and give thought to the future, okay? So fifthly, the wages of labor in different employments vary according to the probability or improbability of success in them. The probability that any particular person shall ever be qualified for the employment to which he is educated is very different in different occupations. In the greater part of mechanic trades, success is almost certain, but very uncertain in the liberal professions. Put your son apprentice to a shoemaker, there is little doubt of his learning to make a pair of shoes. But send him to study law, it is at least 20 to 1 if he ever makes such a proficiency as will enable him to live by the business. In a perfectly fair lottery, those who draw the prizes ought to gain all that is lost by those who draw the blanks. In a profession where 20 fail for one that succeeds, that one ought to gain all that should have been gained by the unsuccessful 20. The counselor at law who, perhaps at near 40 years of age, begins to make something by his profession, ought to receive the retribution, not only of his own so tedious and expensive education, but of that of more than 20 others who are never likely to make anything by it. How extravagant soever the fees of counselors at law may sometimes appear, their real retribution is never equal to this. Compute in any particular place what is likely to be annually gained, and what is likely to be annually spent by all the different workmen in any common trade, such as that of shoemakers or weavers, and you will find that the former sum will generally exceed the latter. But make the same computation with regard to all counselors and students of law in all the different inns of court, and you will find that their annual gains bear but a very small proportion to their annual expense. Even though you rate the former as high and the latter as low, as can well be done. The lottery of the law, therefore, is very far from being a perfectly fair lottery, and that, as well as many other liberal and honorable professions, is, in point of pecuniary gain, evidently under-recompensed. So you will see that the expenses laid out in providing the services of law are much more than those of some of the other professions. And so he's saying it's evidently under recompense. He's saying, and that's true, right? People might have law practice, and unless they're working for a huge law firm, highly successful, and people in practice by themselves, sometimes it's not the most gloriously compensated thing. The expense in paying for the offices and the marketing materials and all that stuff, right? It might be prestigious and honorable, as he calls it, right? But not the most profitable. You don't get the most pecuniary advantages. All right, continuing. Those professions keep their level, however, with other occupations, and, notwithstanding these discouragements, all the most generous and liberal spirits are eager to crowd into them. Two different causes contribute to recommend them. First, the desire of reputation, which attends upon superior excellence in any of them. And, secondly, the natural confidence which every man has more or less, not only in his own abilities, but in his own good fortune. To excel in any profession, in which but a few arrive at mediocrity, is the most decisive mark of what is called genius or superior talents. Again, to excel in any profession, in which but few arrive at mediocrity, is the most decisive mark of what is called genius or superior talents. The public admiration which attends upon such distinguished abilities makes always a part of their reward, a greater or smaller in proportion as it is higher or lower in degree. It makes considerable part of that reward in the profession of physic, a still greater perhaps in that of law, in poetry and philosophy. It makes almost the whole. Once again, the public admiration which attends upon such distinguished abilities makes always a part of their reward, a greater or smaller in proportion as it is higher or lower in degree. It makes a considerable part of that reward in the profession of physic, a still greater perhaps in that of law. In poetry and philosophy, it makes almost the whole. Okay, interesting. Okay, so the reward. Wow, this is what he's saying. This is very cool, right? So the admiration which attends upon such distinguished abilities, right, makes always a part of their reward, a greater or smaller in proportion as it is higher or lower in degree. It makes a considerable part of that reward in the profession of physics, right? So if you're a physicist, right, or something like that, or physician even, because it just says physic. I don't exactly know what it means there, but the admiration, right, is the reward more than just the money that you're getting paid, and perhaps in that of law, right, but in poetry and philosophy, it makes almost the whole. They're saying, the starving artist right there, that their real compensation is in the admiration, right, of their distinguished abilities. Makes sense, right? So this is fascinating here. I like the great detail that's in here. I've just got just a little bit more to go than I thought. Oh my gosh, is this really that much? Holy crap. Okay. All right. There are some very agreeable and beautiful talents of which the possession commands a certain sort of admiration, but of which the exercise for the sake of gain is considered, whether from reason or prejudice, as a sort of public prostitution. What? There are some very agreeable and beautiful talents of which the possession commands a certain sort of admiration, but of which the exercise for the sake of gain is considered, whether from reason or prejudice, as a sort of public prostitution. The pecuniary recompense, therefore, of those who exercise them in this manner must be sufficient not only to pay for the time, labor, and expense of acquiring the talents, but for the discredit which attends the employment of them as a means of subsistence. I guess he's going to give us some examples. The exorbitant rewards of players, opera singers, opera dancers, etc., are founded upon those two principles, the rarity and beauty of the talents, and the discredit of employing them in this manner. It seems absurd at first sight that we should despise their persons, and yet reward their talents with the most profuse liberality. While we do the one, however, we must of necessity do the other. Should the public opinion or prejudice ever alter with regard to such occupations, with pecuniary recompense, their pecuniary recompense would quickly diminish. So he's even talking about celebrities here, right? Like, people love to hate celebrities, but we pay them so much because we flock in droves to watch their movies and buy their albums and listen to their songs, right? And as he says here, opera singers, opera dancers, etc., right? And while we do the one, however, we must necessarily do the other. Should the public opinion or prejudice ever alter with regard to such occupations, their pecuniary, remember, money recompense or compensation would quickly diminish. More people would apply to them, and the competition would quickly reduce the price of their labor. Such talents, though far from being common, are by no means so rare as is imagined. Many people possess them in great perfection, who disdain to make use of them, and many more are capable of acquiring them, if anything could be made honorably by them. The overweening conceit, which the greater part of men have of their own abilities, is an ancient evil remarked by the philosophers and moralists of all ages. Their absurd presumption in their own good fortune has been taken less notice of. It is, however, possible, still more universal. There is no man living who, when in tolerable health and spirits, has not some share of it. The chance of gain is by every man more or less overvalued, and the chance of loss is by most men undervalued, and by scarce any man who is in tolerable health and spirits valued more than it is worth. That the chance of gain is naturally overvalued, we may learn from the universal success of lotteries. The world neither ever saw nor ever will see a perfectly fair lottery. Wow, I mean, the lottery's way back in the day, dude. Is it incredible how this book here is still so relevant, even in many of the older terms and things that he uses, but the stuff that he's saying is still applicable today? I mean, this dude, for whatever kind of magician he was, is still so incredibly influential that I have two other books written in 2017 and 2020 that are still mentioning him. I mean, he's like the Einstein and of economics. I mean, this guy, and I'm just seeing it here. All right, let's go. Let's go. All right, I need to take a quick break for a moment because this is long. So, hello, Cecilia Grace. For anybody who either is just passing through or sitting a spell to listen, welcome. Hello, Cecilia Grace, Reggie Woodson, Slime 063, Wandering Fool, what's up? Good hearing you earlier. Justin Calloway, Tiona, what's up? Truly Julie, Kate, Dow with the dashes, hello. Shonda, Karen Oliver, Eternity, Curtis Ramsey, Penny Frampton, Gabby Garland, Reverend Jen Pennington, Shannon Davis, Sonrisa Del Dia, hello. Sonrisa Del Dia, Aiden Zhu, Bree the Aiden Zhu, ni hao. Bree the Animist, Sharon and Brandy Singleton, hello everybody for stopping by or passing through. You've been listening to Wealth Attraction Research, WAR, WAR. This is Inequality Part 1, and I'm only reading this and not the other two books, The Little Book of Economics or How Money Works, because it's a long Part 1, and then I got to go to Part 2, and then I got to get to those, and then Babylon's Banksters. So, here we go. Okay, so let's go back with the lotteries, right? Because this is good. That the chance of gain is naturally overvalued, we may learn from the universal success of lotteries. The world neither ever saw, nor ever will see, a perfectly fair lottery, or one in which the whole gain compensated the whole loss, because the undertaker could make nothing by it. In the state lotteries, the tickets are really not worth the price which is paid by the original subscribers, and yet commonly sell in the market for 20, 30, and sometimes 40% advance. The vain hope of gaining some of the great prizes is the sole cause of this demand. The soberest people scarce look upon it as a folly to pay a small sum for the chance of gaining 10 or 20,000 pounds, though they know that even that small sum is perhaps 20 or 30% more than the chance is worth. In a lottery in which no prize exceeded 20 pounds, though in the other respects it approached much nearer to a perfectly fair one than that of the common state lotteries, there would not be the same demand for tickets. In order to have a better chance for some of the great prizes, some people purchase several tickets, and others small shares in still a greater number. There is not, however, a more certain proposition in mathematics than that the more tickets you adventure upon, the more likely you are to be a loser. Adventure upon all the tickets in the lottery and you lose for certain. And the greater the number of your tickets, the nearer you approach to this certainty. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I don't do that or go to casinos or gamble at all or lots of other stuff that I think is ridiculous. And not for any reasons that are popular. I've just never liked them. Happy birthday, Flora Elizabeth Carrasco. I just don't like that. It doesn't make sense to me. Never has. I've been to Vegas. I was better off gambling with my sobriety there than at machines. I never touched one slot or even gravitated towards any at all. It doesn't even hold up. I don't know why that. I still haven't figured it. There's a lot of things that my brain completely does not allow me to buy into at all. Literally figuratively. All right. So, adventure upon all the tickets in the lottery and you lose for certain. And the greater number of your tickets, the nearer you approach this certainty. Burpee. That the chance of loss is frequently undervalued and scarce ever valued more than it is worth, we may learn from the very moderate profit of insurers. In order to make insurance, either from fire or sea risk, a trade at all, the common premium must be sufficient to compensate the common losses, to pay the expense of management, and to afford such a profit as might have been drawn from an equal capital employed in any common trade. The person who pays no more than this evidently pays no more than the real value of the risk, or the lowest price at which he can reasonably expect to insure it. But though many people have made a little money by insurance, very few have made a great fortune, and from this consideration alone, it seems evident enough that the ordinary balance of profit and loss is not more advantageous in this than in other common trades by which so many people make fortunes. Moderate, however, as the premium of insurance commonly is, many people despise the risk too much to care to pay it. Taking the whole kingdom at an average, 19 houses in 20, or rather perhaps 99 in 100, are not insured from fire. Sea risk is more alarming to the greater part of people, and the proportion of ships insured to those not insured is much greater. Many sail, however, at all seasons, and even in time of war, without any insurance. This may sometimes perhaps be done without any imprudence. When a great company, or even a great merchant, has 20 or 30 ships at sea, they may, as it were, insure one another. The premium saved upon them all may more than compensate such losses as they are likely to meet with in the common course of chances. The neglect of insurance upon shipping, however, in the same manner as upon houses is, in most cases, the effect of no such nice calculation, but of mere thoughtless rashness and presumptuous contempt of the risk. Right? It's never really that cautious or thoughtful, right? It's presumptuous contempt of the risk. This is what I really love about the language here in this book, right? When was the King James version of the Bible published? What the 1611, right? And this is not so like that, but I really love it. It raises the caliber of my vocabulary just by being exposed to this. All right. The contempt of risk and the presumptuous hope of success are in no period of life more active than at the age at which young people choose their professions. How little the fear of misfortune is then capable of balancing the hope of good luck appears still more evidently in the readiness of the common people to enlist as soldiers or go to sea than in the eagerness of those of better fashion to enter in what are called the liberal professions. See that again. How little the fear of misfortune is then capable of balancing the hope of good luck appears still... Okay, how little the fear of misfortune is then capable of balancing the hope of good luck appears still more evidently in the readiness of common people to enlist as soldiers or go to sea than in the eagerness of those of better fashion to enter into what are called the liberal professions. What a common soldier may lose is obvious enough. You know, this actually gives me insight into the origin of the word, this earlier use of the word fashion, and why so many people are concerned about fashion. Because when he's saying here, those of better fashion, he's talking about people with more money. He's not talking about, well, it is at the same time people who are better dressed, of course, right? Because they're not wearing the rags of the common people of the time, the poorer people, right? They're dressed better, they have better fashion because they have more money. And so this is the disguise that people put on today when they dress up in the way that they do, not for comfort or for utility, but because they want to look fashionable or more affluent or richer than they are. New word unlocked in my brain. Ching. Let me give myself a silver dollar for that. Next new level unlocked. All right. What a common soldier may lose is obvious enough. Without regarding the danger, however, young volunteers never enlist so readily as the beginning of a new war, and though they have scarce any chance of preferment, they figure to themselves, in their youthful fancies, 1,000 occasions of acquiring honor and distinction which never occur. These romantic hopes make the whole price of their blood. Their pay is less than that of common laborers, and in actual service their fatigues are much greater. The lottery of the sea is not altogether so disadvantageous as that of the army. The son of a creditable laborer or artificer may frequently go to sea with his father's consent, but if he enlists as a soldier, it is always without it. Other people see some chance of his making something by the one trade. Nobody but himself sees any of his making anything by the other. The great admiral is less the object of public admiration than the great general. The great admiral is less the object of public admiration than the great general. And the highest success in the sea service promises a less brilliant fortune and reputation than equal success in the land. The same difference runs through all the inferior degrees of preferment in both. That's interesting, right? So, in the army, you seldom get, well, at least then when people were dying in droves in the wars of this country and Europe, they would be like, no, I don't want you to go to war. But the son, as he says, who wants to go to war, thinks they're going to have all this honor and prestige. Whereas, and they still get paid little money, whereas a person going out to sea becomes an admiral, right? We'll see what he says. Less the object of public admiration. I guess that must be a little bit different from now, right? Than the great general. Interesting, but that's true, though. People admire generals more than they do necessarily ship captains. But the highest success in sea service promises a less brilliant fortune and reputation than equal success on the land. Huh. Okay, I can see that. All right, so the same difference runs through all the inferior degrees of preferment in both. By the rules of precedency, a captain in the Navy ranks with a colonel in the Army, but he does not rank with him in the common estimation. As the great prizes in the lottery are less, the smaller ones must be more numerous. Common sailors, therefore, more frequently get some fortune and preferment than common soldiers, and the hope of those prizes is what principally recommends the trade. Though their skill and dexterity are much superior to that of almost any artificers, and though their whole life is one continued scene of hardship and danger, yet for all this dexterity and skill, for all those hardships and dangers, while they remain in the condition of common sailors, they receive scarce any other recompense but the pleasure of exercising the one and of surmounting the other. The pleasure of exercising their skill and the pleasure of surmounting the danger, right? Okay. Their wages are not greater than those of common laborers at the port, which regulates the rate of seamen's wages. As they are continually going from port to port, the monthly pay of those who sail from all the different ports of Great Britain is more nearly upon a level than that of any other workman in those different places, and the rate of the port to and from which the greatest number sail, that is the port of London, regulates that of all the rest. At London, the wages of the greater part of the different classes of workmen are all about double those of the same classes at Edinburgh, but the sailors who sail from the port of London seldom earn above 3 or 4 shillings a month more than those who sail from the port of Leith, and the difference is frequently not so great. In time of peace, and in the merchant service, the London price is from a guinea to about 7 and 20 shillings the calendar month. A common laborer in London, at the rate of 9 or 10 shillings a month, may earn in the calendar month from 40 to 5 and 40 shillings. The sailor, indeed, over and above his pay, is supplied with provisions. Their value, however, may not perhaps always exceed the difference between his pay and that of the common laborer, and though it sometimes should, the excess will not be clear gain to the sailor, because he cannot share it with his wife and family, whom he must maintain out of his wages at home. The dangers and hairbreadth escapes of a life of adventures, instead of disheartening young people, seem frequently to recommend a trade to them. A tender mother, among the inferior ranks of people, is often afraid to send her son to school at seaport town, lest the sight of the ships and the conversation and adventures of the sailors should entice him to go to sea. A tender mother among the inferior ranks of people is often afraid to send her son to school at a seaport town, lest the sight of the ships and the conversation and adventures of the sailors should entice him to go to sea. The distant prospect of hazards, from which we can hope to extricate ourselves by courage and address, is not disagreeable to us, and does not raise the wages of labor in any employment. It is otherwise with those in which courage and address can be of no avail. In trades, which are known to be very unwholesome, the wages of labor are always remarkably high. Unwholesomeness is a species of disagreeableness, and its effects upon the wages of labor are to be ranked under that general head. In all the different employments of stock, the ordinary rate of profit varies more or less with the certainty or uncertainty of the returns. These are in general less uncertain in the inland than in the foreign trade, and in some branches of foreign trade than others. In the trade to North America, for example, than in that to Jamaica. Inland and some branches. These are generally less uncertain than in the foreign trade, than inland than in the foreign trade. And in some branches, it's less uncertain of some branches of foreign trade than others. And the trade to North America is less uncertain, for example, than that to Jamaica. Okay. The ordinary rate of profit always rises more or less with the risk. It does not, however, seem to rise in proportion to it, or so as to compensate it completely. Bankruptcies are most frequent in the most hazard trades. The most hazardous of all trades, that of the smuggler, though when the adventure succeeds, it is likewise the most profitable, is the infallible road to bankruptcy. And so this is what he means, the unwholesomeness. It's another species of disagreeableness. Okay, so let's take this again. Bankruptcies are most frequent in the most hazardous trades. The most hazardous of all trades, that of a smuggler, though when the adventure succeeds, it is likewise the most profitable, is the infallible road to bankruptcy. Though when the adventure succeeds, is likewise the most profitable, is the infallible road to bankruptcy. The presumptuous hope of success seems to act here as upon all other occasions, and to entice so many adventurers into those hazardous trades, that their competition reduces the profit below what is sufficient to compensate the risk. To compensate it completely, the common returns ought, over and above the ordinary profits of stock, not only to make up for all occasional losses, but to afford a surplus profit to the adventurers of the same nature with the profit of insurers. But if the common returns were sufficient for all this, bankruptcies would not be more frequent in these than in other trades. Smugglers. Of the 5 circumstances, therefore, which vary the wages of labor, 2 only affect the profits of stock: the agreeableness or disagreeableness of the business, and the risk or security with which it is attended. In point of agreeableness or disagreeableness, there is little or no difference in the far greater part of the different employments of stock, but a great deal in those of labor. And the ordinary profit of stock, though it rises with the risk, does not always seem to rise in proportion to it. It should follow from all this that, in the same society or neighborhood, the average and ordinary rates of profit in the different employments of stock should be more nearly upon a level than the pecuniary wages of the different sorts of labor. They are so accordingly. The difference between the earnings of a common laborer and those of a well-employed lawyer or physician is evidently much greater than that between the ordinary profits in any 2 different branches of trade. The apparent difference, besides, in the profits of different trades is generally a deception arising from our not always distinguishing what ought to be considered as wages from what ought to be considered as profit. Yep, well, profits are better than wages, as some business people say, right? The difference between the earnings of a common laborer and those of a well-employed lawyer or physician is evidently much greater than that between the ordinary profits in any 2 different branches of trade. So the difference between, of course, being a doctor or a lawyer, right, is going to be much greater, the difference between it, than the common trades, right? But it's not so much between 2 different branches of trade, like selling apples or oranges, not that big of a difference. Or even, let's say, 2 different branches, because those are both fruit, but one might sell, I don't know, wood than in selling fruit, right? But a tree is still a plant that wood comes from, so we could separate even further. Metal is selling copper than apples, right? It's not that difference, the profits of different trades. And the apparent difference, besides, in the profits of different trades is generally a deception arising from our not always distinguishing what ought to be considered as wages, which is wages are salary or your income from your job, from what ought to be considered as profit. People need to understand the difference, right? Profits come from the excess that you get from selling a certain thing, usually like a product or service, whereas wages are what you get directly for doing the job, right? Continuing. Apothecary's profit is become a byword, denoting something uncommonly extravagant. Oh, the drug dealers, the legal drug dealers. He's talking about, he said apothecaries, right? For those you don't know, an apothecary is a pharmacy. All right, pharmacy. All right, so here we go. Apothecary's profit is become a byword. That's what I'm going to start using that. I got that, apothecary's profit. Apothecary's profit has become a byword, denoting something uncommonly extravagant. This great apparent profit, however, is frequently no more than the reasonable wages of labor. The skill of an apothecary is a much nicer and more delicate matter than that of any artificer whatever, and the trust which is reposed in him is of much greater importance. He is the physician of the poor in all cases, and of the rich when the distress or danger is not very great. His reward, therefore, ought to be suitable to his skill and his trust, and it arises generally from the price at which he sells his drugs. But the whole drugs which the best employed apothecary with which the best employed apothecary in a large market town will sell in a year may not perhaps cost him above 30 or 40 pounds, though he should sell them, therefore, for 300 or 400, or at 1,000% profit. This may frequently be no more than the regional wages of his labor charged, in the only way in which he can charge them, upon the price of his drugs. The greater part of the apparent profit is real wages disguised in the garb of profit. There you go, right? That's very true. That makes a lot of sense now that you put it that way. Okay. Right. In a small seaport town, a little grocer will make 40 or 50% upon a stock of a single 100 pounds, while a considerable wholesale merchant in the same place will scarce make 8 or 10% upon a stock of 10,000. The trade of the grocer may be necessary for the conveniency of the inhabitants, and the narrowness of the market may not admit the employment of larger capital in the business. The man, however, must not only live by his trade, but live by it suitably to the qualifications which it requires. Besides possessing a little capital, he must be able to read, write, and account, and must be a tolerable judge, too, of perhaps 50 or 60 different sorts of goods, their prices, qualities, and the markets where they are to be had cheapest. He must have all the knowledge, in short, that is necessary for a great merchant, which nothing hinders him from becoming but the want of sufficient capital. 30 or 40 pounds a year cannot be considered as too great a recompense for the labor of a person so accomplished. Deduct this from the seemingly great profits of his capital, and little more will remain, perhaps, than the ordinary profits of stock. The greater part of the apparent profit is in this case too real wages. Man, this dude is putting it down. Like the depth of how he distinguishes profits from wages and all of that is really becoming very, very clear throughout all of this. I mean, it makes so much sense now, and it's becoming even clearer, and it's not even crystal clear yet to me. I mean, there's a lot more that I'm going to have to definitely figure out as time goes along, and I most certainly believe I will, which is why I'm doing this. But it's going to take some time, but it's getting there. And just these little intricacies, these details are incredible. I find it fascinating, and I'm really, really starting to learn a lot more. This man, the magic really opens in your mind, because the stuff that's becoming so much more clear, and the paths that I'm seeing to so many different things that are unlocking are just, I mean, it's invaluable. All right. The difference between the apparent profit of the retail and that of the wholesale trade is much less in the capital than in small towns and country villages. Where 10,000 pounds can be employed in the grocery trade, the wages of the grocer's labor make but a very trifling addition to the real profits of so great a stock. The apparent profits of the wealthy retailer, therefore, The apparent profits of the wealthy retailer, therefore, are there more nearly upon a level with those of the wholesale merchant. It is upon this account that goods sold by retail are generally as cheap, and frequently much cheaper, in the capital than in the small towns and country villages. Right? And that's, dude, yo, chica, this is exactly what the problem is, what he's talking about here too applies to how big giant chains like Walmart and Amazon, and even Barnes and Nobles to a certain extent, right, have put the smaller businesses out of business, right? Because what happens, right? People go to those places, right? Because what he says is that the goods sold by retail are generally as cheap and frequently much cheaper in the capital than in the small towns and country villages, right? Which applies to, like, you can consider the capital to be one of those big box retailers, where the small town and villages is a mom and pop store, right? That's the analogy there. All right. Grocery goods, for example, are generally much cheaper. Bread and butcher's meat frequently as cheap. It costs no more to bring grocery goods to the great town than to the country village, but it costs a great deal more to bring corn and cattle, as the greater part of them must be brought from a much greater distance. The prime cost of grocery goods, therefore, being the same in both places, they are cheapest where the least profit is charged upon them. The prime cost of bread and butcher's meat is greater in the small town than in the country village, and though the profit is less, therefore they are not always cheaper there, but often equally cheap. In such articles as bread and butcher's meat, the same cause, which diminishes apparent profit, increases prime cost. The extent of the market, by giving employment to greater stocks, diminishes apparent profit, but by requiring supplies from a greater distance, it increases prime cost. This diminution of the one and increase of the other seem, in most cases, nearly to counterbalance one another, which is probably the reason that, though the prices of corn and cattle are commonly very different in different parts of the kingdom, those of bread and butcher's meat are generally very nearly the same throughout the greater part of it. Though the profits of stock, both in the wholesale and retail trade, are generally less in the capital than in small towns and country villages, yet great fortunes are frequently acquired from small beginnings in the former, and scarce ever in the latter. In small towns and country villages, on account of the narrowness of the market, trade cannot always be extended as stock extends. In such places, therefore, though the rate of a particular person's profits may be very high, the sum or amount of them can never be very great, nor consequently that of his annual accumulation. In great towns, on the contrary, trade can be extended as stock increases, and the credit of a frugal and thriving man increases much faster than his stock. His trade is extended in proportion to the amount of both, and the sum or amount of his profits in proportion to the extent of his trade, and his annual accumulation in proportion to the amount of his profits. It seldom happens, however, that great fortunes are made, even in great towns, by anyone regular, established, and well-known branch of business, but in consequence of a long life of industry, frugality, and attention. Sudden fortunes, indeed, are sometimes made in such places by what is called the trade of speculation. This is trading stocks and bonds, it sounds like he's getting to. The speculative merchant, well, kind of, right? Speculation meaning just kind of seeing how you can buy high and sell low, is what one of the original terms of speculation, I believe, is getting here. The speculative merchant exercises no one regular established or well-known branch of business. He is a corn merchant this year, and a wine merchant the next, and a sugar, tobacco, or tea merchant the year after. He enters into every trade when he foresees that it is likely to be more than commonly profitable, and he quits it when he foresees that its profits are likely to return to the level of other trades. His profits and losses, therefore, can bear no regular proportion to those of anyone established and well-known branch of business. A bold adventurer may sometimes acquire a considerable fortune by 2 or 3 successful speculations, but is just as likely to lose one by 2 or 3 unsuccessful ones. This trade can be carried on nowhere but in great towns. It is only in places of the most extensive commerce and correspondence that the intelligence requisite for it can be had. The 5 circumstances mentioned above, though they occasion considerable inequalities in the wages of labor and profits of stock, occasion none in the whole of the advantages and disadvantages, real or imaginary, of the different employments of either. The nature of those circumstances is such that they make up for a small pecuniary gain in some and counterbalance a great one in others. In order, however, that this equality may take place in the whole of their advantages or disadvantages, 3 things are requisite, even when there is the most perfect freedom. First, see, and this is going back to what he started off in the beginning saying, right? The very beginning should be put out here, right? The whole of the advantages and disadvantages of the different employments of labor and stock, right? In the same neighborhood, by either perfectly, they have to be either perfectly equal or continually tending to be equal, right? So the advantages and disadvantages must be perfectly equal or continuing to equality, right? So he says, in order, however, that this equality may take place in the whole of their advantages or disadvantages, 3 things are requisite even when there is the most perfect freedom, right? And he says also, too, that that there's not perfect freedom. He says that in reality, that in Europe, it nowhere leaves things at perfect liberty. Now let's continue. He says, but these 3 things, and this is why he mentions this here, he says 3 things are requisite or required even when there is the most perfect freedom. So he's saying, like, look, even when there is the most perfect freedom, you still need these things. There's not perfect freedom, but even when there is, these things need to be had. First, the employments must be well known and long established in the neighborhood. Secondly, they must be in their ordinary, or what may be called their natural state. And thirdly, they must be the sole or principal employments of those who occupy them. All right. Going back to the little magic hack earlier in this spell book, right? One of the things that needs to be repeated before going on to this part is the idea about trust and skill and dexterity, high levels of skill and dexterity and trust, and how self-education by reading books and practicing and then making it known this is why this is a very good saying right here. So take this to heart. This is a very important thing right here. And it's been one of the most difficult things for me because I come off as very arrogant and whatever other negative connotations to that word may come with it. But this is a very important thing for people to get, though, in the KLT, right, idea, get people to know, like, and trust you, right? It's this. People don't care how much you know unless or until they know how much you care. People don't care how much you know unless they know how much you care. And so if people know that you care, that you're actually there to help, that's really important, and just as important in how much you know. Because, of course, if you care a lot, right, but you don't know a lot, then you can get yourself into problems. Sort of like there's this Japanese saying. I was with my friend in Los Angeles, Noriko Kobayashi, and we were sitting down on some mats in her floor, and she was showing me this book by this monk, and there was something that was very interesting that was said. And it's similar to that saying that says, it's better to be a warrior and a gardener in a garden than a gardener in a war, right? But more closely to what I'm saying here, what's in this book here about this, people don't care how much you know unless they know how much you care, is that that strength without love is violence. And love without strength is useless. So you could have strength but no love, and you'll just be barbarous and wild and beating up people, right? No love, no humanity. But love without strength is useless, because you could love your whole family, your wife, your kids, or anything like that, but if you're not strong enough to protect them, what good is your love? I know that sounds harsh, right? But that's here again. People don't care how much you know unless they know how much you care. But then again, it doesn't matter how much you care unless you know how to provide that care. That's the last part that I was going to say about that. You can care a lot, but you also have to have the requisite or required skill. Once people know that you care and they want to entrust their whatever to you, right, then you have to come with it. You have to have that skill. All right. All right, so this is these three long things, right? First, in order for this equality to take place, right, the employments must be well known and long established in the neighborhood. People must know about what the hell you're doing. Do they know what this kind of job? Did you just make something up to start working? If so, change the name to something that's more familiar and that's similar to what you do. Secondly, they must be in their ordinary or what may be called their natural state. And thirdly, they must be the sole or principal employments of those who occupy them. You know, that's talking about specialists, or that you're not seen as somebody who's all over the place, like me. First, this equality can take place only in those employments which are well known and have been long established in the neighborhood. Where all other circumstances are equal, wages are generally higher in new than in old trades. When a projector attempts to establish a new manufacture, he must at first entice his workmen from the other employments by higher wages than they can either earn in their own trades or than the nature of his work would otherwise require, and a considerable time must pass away before he can venture to reduce them to the common level. Manufactures, for which the demand arises altogether from fashion and fancy, are continually changing and seldom last long enough to be considered as old established manufactures. Those, on the contrary, for which the demand arises chiefly from use or necessity, are less liable to change, and their same form or fabric may continue in demand for whole centuries together. The wages of labor, therefore, are likely to be higher in manufactures of the former than in those of the latter kind. Right? This is, oh man, these intricacies, these details. Manufactures for which the demand arises altogether from fashion and fancy are continually changing and seldom last long enough to be considered as old established manufactures. Right? This is, remember, he's talking about equality, right? The reason why it's higher is because the fashion and fancy is not going to be around as long. Just like in the case of the laborers who don't have constancy of work, get paid more because they're not always going to be employed. This is applying to a whole stock and trade. The older, more established ones are going to be around longer so they can even out. The newer ones tend to get more because who knows when how long they're gonna stay. Right, and like he says, they seldom last long enough to be considered as old established manufacturers. Those, on the contrary, for which the demand arises chiefly from use or necessity, are less liable to change, and the same form or fabric may continue in demand, jeans, for whole centuries altogether. The wages of labor, therefore, are likely to be higher in manufacturers of the former, right, the first, the fancy, than in those of the latter kind. Birmingham deals chiefly in manufactures of the former kind, Sheffield in those of the latter, and the wages of labor in those two different places are said to be suitable to this difference in the nature of their manufactures. So Birmingham deals in fashion, whereas Sheffield deals in necessity. And in the fashion, they get paid more, and necessity less. And everybody knows that even today, right? Once again, people are paying for fashion. Why? To look like they're in fashion, like they're richer than, or more well off than they really are. That's the origin of fashion, by the way. People trying to look a part that they're actually not. They're keeping up with the Joneses. The ridiculousness of the fashion, right? And from my point of view, again, one of those things that are kind of crazy. I have my own fashion, but it's not fashion in the truest sense. It's utility. I dress to work. to be able to move around, to be able to kick things and flip and move and roll on the ground, pick things up, lift stuff, climb all over things, drive for long distances. That's how I dress. And the best gear for that is like tactical gear, cargo pants, things like that. And then my accessories are spiked gauntlets and bracelets. So just in case somebody tries to grab me by the arm, I'll stab him in the eyeball. No, I'm just joking. Or maybe I'm not. All right, secondly, let's continue. The establishment of any new manufacture, of any new branch of commerce, or of any new practice in agriculture is always a speculation from which the projector promises himself extraordinary profits. These profits sometimes are very great, and sometimes more frequently perhaps they are quite otherwise, but in general they bear no regular proportion to those of other old trades in the neighborhood. If the project succeeds, they are commonly at first very high. When the trade or practice becomes thoroughly established and well known, the competition reduces them to the level of other trades. See that? Right. Secondly, this equality in the whole of the advantages and disadvantages of the different employments of labor and stock can take place only in the ordinary, or what might be called the natural state of those employments. The demand for almost every different species of labor is sometimes greater and sometimes less than usual. In the one case, the advantages of the employment rise above, in the other they fall below the common level. The demand for country labor is greater at hay time and harvest than during the greater part of the year, and wages rise with the demand. In time of war, when 40 or 50,000 sailors are forced from the merchant service into that of the king, the demand for sailors to merchant ships necessarily rises with this scarcity, and their wages upon such occasions commonly rise from a guinea and 7 and 20 shillings to 40 shillings and 3 pounds a month. That's more for y'all that don't know. That's why I said their wages rise, right? In a decaying manufacture, on the contrary, many workmen, rather than quit their old trade, are contented with smaller wages than would otherwise be suitable to the nature of their employment. Why? The profits of stock vary with the price of the commodities in which it is employed. The profits of stock vary with the price of the commodities in which it is employed. The profits of stock. So again, the stock is that stuff that is labored upon and made into something else, a piece of metal turned into a tool, and the tool becomes a commodity. Or the wool from the sheep is the stock, and it's worked upon and turned into a coat, and that becomes a commodity. So you can profit from stock. The profits of stock vary with the price of the commodities in which it is employed. As the price of any commodity rises above the ordinary or average rate, the profits of at least some part of the stock that is employed in bringing it to market rise above their proper level, and as it falls, they sink below it. All commodities are more or less liable to variations of price, but some are much more so than others. In all commodities which are produced by human industry, the quantity of industry annually employed is necessarily regulated by the annual demand in such a manner that the average annual produce may, as nearly as possible, be equal to the average annual consumption. In some employments, it has already been observed the same quantity of industry will always produce the same or very nearly the same quantity of commodities. In the linen or woolen manufactures, for example, the same number of hands will annually work up very nearly the same quantity of linen and woolen cloth. The variations in the market price of such commodities, therefore, can arise only from some accidental variation in the demand. A public mourning raises the price of black cloth, but as the demand for most sorts of plain linen and woolen cloth is pretty uniform, so is likely the price. But there are other employments in which the same quality of industry will not always produce the same quantity of commodities. The same quantity of industry, for example, will, in different years, produce very different quantities of corn, wine, hops, sugar, tobacco, etc. And the price of such commodities, therefore, varies not only with the variations of demand, but with the much greater and more frequent variations of quantity as supply, and is consequently extremely fluctuating. But the profit of some of the dealers must necessarily fluctuate with the price of the commodities. The operations of the speculative merchant are principally employed about such commodities. He endeavors to buy them up when he foresees that their price is likely to rise, and to sell them when it is likely to fall. So that stock, right, those materials that are needed, he's looking at which market is going up. I'm going to buy them because I know the price is going to go up. Buy them low, sell high. Thirdly, this equality in the whole of the advantages and disadvantages of the different employments of labor and stock can take place only in such as are the sole or principal employments of those who occupy them. When a person derives his substance from one employment, which does not occupy the greater part of his time, in the intervals of his leisure, he is often willing to work at another for less wages than would otherwise suit the nature of the employment. There still subsists in many parts of Scotland a set of people called cottars or cottagers, and though they were more frequent some years ago than they are now. Okay, so there still subsists in many parts of Scotland a set of people called cottars or cottagers, though they were more frequent some years ago than they are now. They are a sort of outservants of the landlords and farmers. The usual reward which they receive from their masters is a house, a small garden for pot herbs, as much grass as will feed a cow, and perhaps an acre or two of bad arable land. When their master has occasion for their labor, he gives them, besides 2 pecks of oatmeal a week, worth about 16 pence sterling. When their master has occasion for their labor, he gives them, besides, 2 pecks of oatmeal a week, worth about 16 pence sterling. During a great part of the year, he has little or no occasion for their labor, and the cultivation of their own little possession is not sufficient to occupy the time which is left at their own disposal. When such occupiers were more numerous than they are at present, they are said to have been willing to give their spare time for a very small recompense to anybody, and to have wrought for less wages than other laborers. In ancient times they seem to have been common all over Europe. In countries ill cultivated and worse inhabited, the greater part of landlords and farmers could not otherwise provide themselves with the extraordinary number of hands which country labor requires at certain seasons. The daily or weekly recompense which such laborers occasionally receive from their masters was evidently not the whole price of their labor. Their small tenement made a considerable part of it. A tenement is there where they lived, right? This daily or weekly recompense, however, seems to have been considered as the whole of it by many writers who have collected the prices of labor and provisions in ancient times, and who have taken pleasure in representing both as wonderfully low. The produce of such labor comes frequently cheaper to market than would otherwise be suitable to its nature. Stockings in many parts of Scotland are knit much cheaper than they can anywhere be wrought upon the loom. They are the work of servants and labourers, who derive the principal part of their subsistence from some other employment. More than 1,000 pair of Shetland stockings are annually imported into Leith, of which the price is from 5 pence to 7 pence a pair. At Lerwick, the small capital of the Shetland Islands, 10 pence a day, I have been assured, is a common price of common labor. In the same islands they knit worsted stockings to the value of a guinea a pair and upward. The spinning of linen yarn is carried on in Scotland nearly in the same way as the knitting of stockings, by servants who are chiefly hired for other purposes. They earn but a very scanty subsistence, who endeavor their whole livelihood either by either of those trades, right? So, again, Because that's not the only thing they do. They're not specialists. They make a lot less than the people who spend all their time doing it because they do other stuff sometimes. But they earn but a very scanty subsistence who endeavor to get their whole livelihood by either of those trades. In most parts of Scotland, she is a good spinner who can earn 20 pence a week. In most parts of Scotland, she is a good spinner who can earn 20 pence a week. In opulent countries, the market is generally so extensive that any one trade is sufficient to employ the whole labor and stock of those who occupy it. Instances of people living by one employment and at the same time deriving some little advantage from another occur chiefly in poor countries. The following instance, however, of something of the same kind is to be found in the capital of a very rich one. There is no city in Europe, I believe, in which house rent is dearer than in London. That's more expensive than in London. And yet I know no capital in which a furnished apartment can be hired so cheap. Lodging is not only much cheaper in London than in Paris, it is much cheaper than in Edinburgh of the same degree of goodness, and what may seem extraordinary, the dearness of house rent is the cause of the cheapness of lodging. The dearness of house rent in London arises not only from those causes which render it dear in all great capitals, the dearness of labor, the dearness of all the materials of building, which must generally be brought from a great distance, and above all the dearness of ground rent, every landlord acting the part of a monopolist, and frequently exacting a higher rent for a single acre of bad land in town than can be had for 100 of the best in the country. But it arises in part from the peculiar manners and customs of the people, which oblige every master of a family to hire a whole house from top to bottom. A dwelling house in England means everything that is contained under the same roof. In France, Scotland, and many other parts of Europe, it frequently means no more than a single story. A tradesman in London is obliged to hire a whole house in that part of the town where his customers live. His shop is upon the ground floor, and he and his family sleep in the garret, and he endeavors to pay a part of his house rent by letting the 2 middle stories to lodgers. He expects to maintain his family by his trade and not by his lodgers, whereas at Paris and Edinburgh, the people who let lodgings have commonly no other means of subsistence, and the price of the lodgings must pay not only the rent of the house, but the whole expense of the family. Wow. All right. That's taken me long enough. I still have a whole part 2 to go, which is called The Inequalities Occasioned by the Policy of Europe. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, oh boy, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So that's 24 pages to go. Well, I'm done. I need to take a break. You've been listening to Wealth Attraction Research. WAR, War, Inequality Part 1, presented by Hakeem Alibokis Alexander on Spreaker, Social Podcasting, and Wisdom. Social Audio Inc., presented for World Reading Club in association with ExercisingYourMind.com and Uniquilibrium.